The train came into Greystone at 2:30 in the afternoon, and the platform was the kind of place that made you feel watched before you had done anything worth watching. Mabel Hurst stood at the top of the car steps and looked at the town the way a woman looks at something she has committed to before she fully understood what she was committing to. Colorado Territory in October had a particular quality of light, thin and honest, the kind that did not soften anything. The mountains behind the town were already carrying snow on their upper reaches, and the wind off them moved through the platform with a cold that had no opinion about who you were or where you had come from. She came down the steps. She was a large woman, broad through the shoulders and full through the body, and she moved the way she always moved, deliberately, with the careful weight of someone who had learned early that taking up space required a kind of quiet justification she should not have needed to provide. Her dress was a deep wool blue, let out at the seams by her own hand with stitching close and even, because she had wanted to arrive looking like someone worth arriving for. The hat was small and practical, the kind a woman wears when she means to work. She had sold her mother's looking-glass for the ticket, the good wool blanket, the winter cloak she would need before December. She had stepped off that train with 43 cents in her coat pocket, and the understanding that the man who had written to the matrimonial agency in Columbus was standing somewhere on this platform. Edmund Harwick Greele was not a difficult man to find. He was the kind of man who positioned himself so that finding him was inevitable. He stood at the far end of the platform in a coat that cost more than Mabel's passage, with 2 other men flanking him the way men stand when they are attending something they expect to find uncomfortable but professionally necessary. He was holding the photograph. She had spent 2 weeks of mending wages on that portrait, gone to the photographer in Columbus on a Tuesday morning when the light was good, and sat very still while the man arranged his equipment. She had worn the blue dress, the same one she wore now. She had wanted to look like herself, but a version of herself that might translate well across distance. It had not translated the way she intended. Greele looked at the photograph. He looked up at her. He looked at the photograph again. His face did the thing faces do when an expectation meets a reality and the numbers do not reconcile. And then he folded the photograph in half, then in half again, and put it in the pocket of his coat. He said it clearly enough that the men beside him heard it, clearly enough that the woman with the 2 children near the station door heard it, clearly enough that the station master at his window and the freight handlers by the loading dock heard every word. "You look nothing like this," he said. "You did not represent yourself accurately. I cannot proceed on the basis of misrepresentation." Then he put his hat straight, turned, and walked back down the platform. One of the 2 men said something Mabel could not hear, and Greele laughed. It was the short, relieved laugh of a man who has done an uncomfortable thing and found it easier than expected. And then they were gone. Mabel stood on the bottom step of the train car with her bag in her hand. The train was pulling out behind her. A woman with 2 children had stopped walking. The freight handlers held their hands still on a crate. The station master looked at his ledger with a pen that was not moving. Nobody spoke. The platform held itself in the particular silence of people who have witnessed something they have already decided not to involve themselves in. She had sold her mother's looking-glass for this ticket. She took her hand off the railing, picked up her bag with both hands, and walked off the platform. She found the bench outside the station door and sat down on it and put her hands in her lap and looked at the street. She did not look back at the platform. There was nothing on it anymore that belonged to her. She sat there and did what she had learned to do in difficult situations, which was to take accurate stock of what was actually available. 43 cents, 1 bag, 1 town where nobody knew her name. The next train east would not come through until Thursday. She had 3 days and 43 cents and a bench outside a train station in a territory she had never been to before. She noticed the boy without planning to. He was perhaps 8 years old, red-cheeked from the cold, his coat buttoned wrong at the top so that it hung slightly crooked on one side. He moved through the space near the trading post with the focused calm of a child who has developed a specific skill and trusts it. He stopped near the barrel at the counter with his back to the room, and his hand moved once, quick and practiced, and something disappeared into his coat. He turned around and found her watching him from the bench across the street. He went completely still. His eyes were wide and calculating at the same time, working through whether she was the kind of adult who called out or the kind who did not. Mabel held his gaze for one moment. Then she looked down at her hands. When she looked up, he was gone. She picked up her bag and crossed the street to the sheriff's office because it was the only door on the street that she felt she had a reasonable claim to walk through without an invitation. Sheriff Ambrose Briggs was a compact man of about 60, with a gray mustache and the air of someone who had heard most things at least twice. He looked at her when she came through the door, looked at the bag, looked at her face, and pulled out the chair across from his desk without saying anything. She told him in plain terms, the matrimonial agency in Columbus, the correspondence over 4 months, the ticket she had purchased with wages she had saved through 2 winters, the photograph, the platform, the folded photograph in Greel's coat pocket. Briggs listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who is running through what he has available rather than what he feels about what he has just heard. "I know a man," he said. "Widower, 4 children. Ranch 8 miles out, up toward the ridge. He has been needing help since the spring and has not done anything about it." "Why not?" Mabel said. "Stubborn," Briggs said, "and the kind of man who does not ask for things." He sent a boy up the street. While they waited, Mabel looked around the office. There was a notice board on the wall beside the door with papers pinned to it. Land filings, wanted notices, local ordinances in various states of fading. Near the bottom, a printed notice on heavier paper. Harrow Creek Land and Banking Company. Harwick Greel, Representative. Delinquent property filings for the winter season 1882 to 1883. 3 names she did not recognize. 3 properties in the valley below the ridge. She looked at that notice for a long time. She looked at Greel's name at the bottom of it. She looked at the 3 property names. She thought about the laugh on the platform, the short, relieved laugh of a man who had found something easier than expected. She thought about what it meant to hold paper on land in a valley where the winters closed the roads for 5 weeks at a stretch. She filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that were not yet useful, but might become so. Amos Calloway came through the door 18 minutes later with a flour sack over one shoulder and sawdust on the back of his sleeve, and the look of a man whose morning had just changed shape on him in a way he had not accounted for. He was tall and broad through the chest, with the kind of build that comes from actual labor over many years, not from any particular attention to it. His face was weathered, and his eyes were the particular gray of a sky that has not decided yet what it is going to do. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. She looked back. Briggs explained in 4 sentences. Amos set the flour sack against the wall. He looked at her the way a practical man looks at a practical problem, taking the measure of what was in front of him and what it would require. "I have 4 children," he said. "Oldest is 15. Ranch is 8 miles out, and the road gets bad in winter." She had been doing the arithmetic since the platform. "I will work for 1 meal a day," she said. "Just give me a roof." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back without looking away, because looking away would cost her something she could not afford to lose. "Come on, then," he said. He picked up her bag before she reached it and carried it out without asking. She climbed up onto the wagon herself, not waiting for a hand she had not been offered and did not intend to require. The flour sack went into the wagon bed, and she settled on the bench beside Amos with her hands in her lap and watched the town of Greystone rearrange itself as the wagon pulled away from the station. The boy was there. He was in the wagon bed, back against the flour sack, as if he had always been there, and the question of how he had gotten there was not particularly interesting. He looked at her across the wagon bed with those same calculating eyes from outside the trading post, running the same assessment he had run before, and arriving at a conclusion she could not quite read. She looked at the road. After a while, she heard movement. She looked. The boy had reached into his coat and produced 4 crackers, slightly flattened. He held them out across the wagon bed without particular ceremony, the way you hold something out when you have assessed a situation and arrived at a practical conclusion. She took one. He pulled his hand back and ate the remaining 3 in 2 bites and turned to look at the trees going past. She ate the cracker. It tasted like the particular satisfaction of something offered without explanation and received without commentary. 8 miles up the Ridge Road, Colorado Territory in October, with mountains on both sides and the cold coming off them steady and clean, and the boy in the wagon bed watching the trees go past with his chin on his crossed arms. She looked at the road and did the new arithmetic. 1 meal a day, 4 children, a roof, a man who communicated in flour sacks and direct sentences. The ranch came through the trees in the late afternoon when the light was already going amber and thin. A log house with a good roof and 2 outbuildings and a fence that had been maintained with attention, if not with much recent enthusiasm. She saw the kitchen window first, a girl moving behind the glass with the quick, purposeful motion of someone who has been running a household long enough that the motions are no longer conscious. Amos pulled the wagon to the kitchen door, and the door opened before he finished with the reins. Clara Calloway was 15 years old and already reading the yard before she had fully cleared the threshold. She looked at her father, then at the wagon, then at the woman on the bench. She was tall for her age, with her father's gray eyes and a set to her jaw that suggested she had developed opinions about most things and had not found much reason to revise them. Her eyes went to the dress, the deep blue wool, the seams let out by careful hand, the particular cut of a dress that had not started as a work dress and had not been altered into anything that disguised what it had started as. She understood what she was looking at. Clara Calloway was 15 years old, and she had been running this household since her mother died in the spring of 1882, and she understood exactly what she was looking at. Her face closed. Behind her in the doorway, 2 boys. Reed, 13 years old, standing with the stillness of a boy who has learned to assess situations before responding to them, and pressed against the doorpost at the very edge of the frame. A small girl, perhaps 4 years old, watching with the total, unblinking attention of a child who has not yet learned to look away from things that matter. In the yard, the boy from the wagon, Finn, had dropped himself off the back without announcement and stood a few feet from the wagon, looking between his father and the woman on the bench with those calculating eyes. Mabel climbed down from the wagon before Amos had said a word. She walked to the porch steps, and she looked at Clara directly. "I am not your father's wife," she said. "I am nobody's wife. I am the help. I will sleep wherever there is space, and I will not touch your mother's things." Clara looked at her, then at her father. "Her name is Mabel," Amos said. "She will help with the house." Something moved through Clara's face and arrived at a decision that had no warmth in it, but was not yet a closed door. She stepped aside. 1 step, just enough. Mabel picked up her own bag and carried it through the door. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and something that had been cooked recently and not quite successfully. And underneath both of those, the smell of a house that had been maintained by effort and will, but was still working to remember how to be a home. She set her bag against the wall. She stood in the middle of the kitchen in a dress made for a wedding that had lasted approximately 40 seconds and looked at what was in front of her. She did not look in the cold stove, which should not have been cold at this hour. She did not look at the flour bin, which was lower than it should be for a household of 6. She did not look at the mending pile on the chair by the window, which had reached a height that suggested it had been added to regularly and addressed infrequently. She looked at Clara standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and her chin up, and the particular exhaustion in her eyes of someone who has been strong for a very long time and is not willing to be seen not being strong. Then Mabel looked away. She took off her coat. She hung it on the hook by the door. She sat down at the mending pile, picked up the first shirt, threaded a needle from the case she kept in her bag, and began. The first morning she was awake before Clara came down. She lay on the narrow cot in the small room off the kitchen and listened to the house. The particular way a house sounds when it is running at a size it was not designed to manage alone. She waited until she heard the stove catch and the cast-iron pan set down with the deliberate sound of someone who has been doing this alone for long enough that the deliberateness has become habit. She did not go out immediately. She had learned that the fastest way to lose ground in a difficult situation was to arrive in someone else's space before they were ready for you. She waited until she heard the children coming down, the heavier step of Reed first, then the 2 lighter ones, and finally the small, uneven sound of Dot managing stairs that were still slightly too tall for her. Then she got up, dressed, folded her blanket, and went into the kitchen. Clara was at the stove with her back to the room, porridge on, biscuits in the pan. She did not look up when Mabel came through the door. Mabel stood inside the doorway and looked at the kitchen the way she had always looked at every kitchen she had ever worked in, taking inventory without appearing to. The flour bin low, the salt pork cut into portions smaller than the household required. The biscuits in the pan were the right number for 4 children and 1 man, not for 4 children and 1 man and 1 extra woman. She had not been counted. She went to the mending she had left unfinished the night before and picked up where she had stopped. "Where is the mending basket kept?" she said, not to make conversation, because she needed to know. Clara turned from the stove. Something moved through her expression, a small adjustment, the recalibration of someone who has been expecting a different kind of opening. She nodded toward the shelf beside the window. "Is there a system," Mabel said, "for which gets done first?" "Amos's work shirts," Clara said. "Then the children's. Then whatever else." "All right," Mabel said, and went back to the shirt in her lap. Clara went back to the stove. The biscuits came out slightly dark at the edges. Clara set them on the table without comment. Reed, the older boy, 13 and already carrying his father's habit of silence, sat and ate without looking up. Finn came in behind him, stopped in the doorway when he saw Mabel, ran his assessment, and sat and pulled the nearest biscuit toward him. He reached for another. Clara said his name in 1 word. He took 1 more anyway, but more slowly. Dot came down last, both feet on each step, 1 hand on the wall, crossed the kitchen floor without looking at Mabel, climbed onto the bench beside Reed, and waited for her bowl. Amos came in from the barn at 7:30 with the cold still on his coat. He looked at the table, at the children, at Mabel in the corner with the mending, and poured his own coffee and ate a biscuit standing at the counter the way a man eats when sitting down has become something he has stopped doing without noticing when he stopped. He finished, put his cup in the basin, and went back outside. Finn watched the door close. Then he looked at Mabel. She was threading a new needle. He went back to his biscuit. Mabel worked through the mending pile steadily across the morning. Clara cleaned the kitchen around her without acknowledging her coat on the hook. When the kitchen was done, Clara started bread. working the dough with the force of a girl who had taught herself the motions from memory, right in structure, but fighting the material rather than reading it. At noon, Mabel set the mending aside and went to the larder. She looked at what was there with the practiced eye of a woman who had grown up in a house where the contents of the larder were never taken for granted. The dried beans pushed to the back, the cornmeal, the salt pork, 2 eggs and a heel of bread going hard. At the current rate, this household had perhaps 3 weeks before the larder began to show real strain. She could stretch that to 5, maybe 6, if she started now. She did not say this. She took what she needed for the midday meal, closed the larder, and started the stove. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, watching. Mabel did not tell her to leave. She did not ask her to help. She reached for the salt. "Second jar from the left," Clara said. "The right one is for baking." Mabel moved her hand to the second jar. "Thank you," she said. Clara said nothing, but she did not leave the doorway either. That afternoon, Mabel walked the property line to the south edge where the tree line met the fence. The wild greens were still there, lamb's quarters and wood sorrel and dandelion, the late-season growth that most people did not bother with because they did not need to. She gathered what she could carry in her apron and brought it back to the kitchen and hung the greens to dry on the nail behind the back door where they would not be in anyone's way. And she went back to the mending. The days after it had their own shape. Mabel worked through the mending pile and started on the socks. She learned the particular sound of each person's step on the stairs, the weight and speed of each. The way Reed's step changed when his father was still outside at supper time, and the way it changed again when his father came through the door. She learned that Finn moved through the ranch with the specific attention of someone cataloging useful things for future reference. She learned that Dot did not speak much but watched everything, and that what she watched, she remembered. Clara did not warm. She did not close further, either. She made breakfast and managed the house and operated within 3 feet of Mabel for the better part of each day and maintained a careful, professional distance that Mabel respected because she understood it. This was Clara's house. Clara had been keeping it alive by force of will since she was 14 years old. Mabel was not going to take that from her by arriving with opinions. She was going to work beside her until Clara decided what to do with her. Amos noticed things without appearing to. One morning, the wood box outside her room, which had been empty, was full. She had said nothing about needing wood. The stiff latch on her door, which she had managed without comment, was smooth one morning without explanation. A second lamp appeared on the kitchen shelf. He said nothing about any of it. Neither did she. At the end of the first week, she began the stores in earnest. Behind the flour sack in the bottom of the larder, she started a collection of crocks, rendered fat saved from the cutting board, dried greens pressed into the jars she found in the back of the shelf. She worked in the early mornings before the house woke, and in the evenings after the dishes were done. She moved quietly and accounted for what she used, and made certain that nothing she preserved was taken from the household's current supply. She was building a reserve against something she could not name yet. But the notice on the wall of the sheriff's office had been printed in October of 1882, and 3 families had lost their land in the valley that winter, and Harwick Greel's name was at the bottom of it in clean, official type. She had grown up with not enough. You learned to see what other people walked past. You learned to put something by before you knew you needed it, because by the time you knew you needed it, it was too late to start. She worked and she watched and she said what needed to be said and not a word more than that. The cracker on the wagon, the second jar from the left, the bread that rose on the 3rd day after she told Clara about the starter without telling her what to do about it. She had been taking the smallest portion her whole life. She had gotten good at it. But on the 8th night, sitting on the edge of her narrow cot with her bag still not fully unpacked, Mabel Hurst noticed something she had not expected to notice. She was not counting the days until Thursday. She was not doing the arithmetic of escape. She was thinking about the larder and what could still be gathered from the south tree line before the freeze, and about Clara's hands in the bread dough and the specific way she gripped it, fighting it, and about Reed watching the door at supper time and the way his shoulders changed when his father came through it. She was thinking about tomorrow. For a woman who had spent the better part of 3 days on a train calculating her options on the far end of a journey that had not gone the way she planned. Thinking about tomorrow was not a small thing. She lay down on the cot and pulled the blanket up. Outside, the mountains held their cold, and the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the house above her, a child was sleeping, with the particular depth of sleep that is only possible when someone is keeping watch. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow there was mending to finish and a larder to consider, and a girl who was fighting her bread dough instead of reading it, and a boy who watched the tree line like he was expecting something from it, and a man who communicated in full wood boxes and smooth latches, and had not once in 8 days looked at her body as though it were a problem he needed to comment on. She had 43 cents and 1 meal a day and a roof. She had begun, for the first time in longer than she could measure, to think that working with what was here might be enough. The second week moved differently than the first. The first week had been about learning the shape of things, the weight of each footstep, the temperature of each silence, the specific geography of a household that had been running on will and habit, and the particular determination of a 15-year-old girl who had decided that falling apart was not something she had time for. The second week was about what happened after you had learned the shape of things and had to decide what to do with what you knew. Mabel kept her pace steady. She did not push into spaces that were not yet open to her. She did not offer opinions that had not been asked for. She worked through the mending, through the larder inventory she conducted quietly in her head, through the early mornings gathering what was still available at the south tree line before the frost came down hard enough to end it. She rendered fat from the cutting board scraps and packed it into crocks and added dried apple skins, pressed flat in paper, and the last of the lamb's quarters, and 2 jars of preserved wild greens that she had processed in the evenings when the kitchen was otherwise empty. She put everything at the back of the bottom shelf, behind the flour sack that no one moved. November came in with a different quality of cold. Not the clean, honest cold of October, but something more deliberate. The cold of a season that has decided to be serious. The mornings were harder now, the ground ringing underfoot, the water in the outside barrel developing a skin of ice that had to be broken before the first chores. Mabel woke earlier and lay in the dark listening to the ranch adjust to each morning, the wood contracting, the gaps in the eaves finding new voices. She was building something in the larder, and she was building something else at the same time, something that had no name yet and required more patience than the preserving did. Clara made breakfast. Mabel worked beside her when Clara allowed it, and across the room when she did not. She learned to read the difference without being told. She learned that Clara's bread improved not because Mabel had told her anything further about it, but because Clara was the kind of person who, once shown a principle, worked at it until she understood it fully and on her own terms. The loaves in November were not the loaves of October. They were still Clara's loaves, which was the only kind that counted in this kitchen. One afternoon in the second week of November, Finn came into the yard dragging the spoke from the small wagon wheel behind him. Mabel was at the back of the house taking down the dried greens from the nail. She looked at the spoke. She looked at Finn, who was wearing the expression of a boy who has already run through how the next part of this story goes and does not prefer the direction it is heading. "Your father is in the north field," she said. "He knows how to fix it," Finn said, with the particular inflection of a boy who finds this fact to be the problem rather than the solution. "Show me what is in the tool shed," Mabel said. He looked at her for a moment, running his assessment. He showed her. They worked for 2 hours. She knew more about the repair than she let him see, and she kept slightly behind where he was, letting him find each solution a half step ahead of her, letting him fit the spoke and drive the pin while she held the wheel steady. When it was done, he stood back with his hands on his hips in the exact posture of a man who had not yet grown into the posture. "Don't tell Papa," he said. "Your father has enough on his mind," she said. Something shifted in Finn's face. Not warmth exactly. Something prior to warmth. A first loosening of something that had been held carefully in place since the day she had arrived on that wagon bench. He put the tools back where they belonged without being asked. Reed was the one she watched most carefully. He was 13 years old, and he worked like a man and said almost nothing, but every evening without exception, when Amos came in from the fields, Reed was already at the table, not eating, just there. His eyes would go to his father's face the moment the door opened. One quick look, there and gone, and then he would drop his head and pick up his fork. She had watched it enough times to understand what he was looking for, and what he found, and what he did with both. She started having supper on the table the moment she heard Amos's boots on the porch. The evenings when Reed came in to the smell of hot food and his father coming through the door at the same time, he sat differently, looser, like something that he had been carrying since morning could be set down for a few hours. He never said anything to her about it. She did not require him to. Dot had stopped treating her as furniture. She had not started treating her as anything warmer than a permanent feature of the kitchen, but she had stopped the careful path around Mabel that had characterized the first week. She moved through the spaces Mabel occupied without the deliberate detour. She watched Mabel's hands when Mabel was at the counter, the needle going in and out, the knife moving through vegetables, the way Mabel folded pastry dough, and she watched with the total focused attention of a child who is learning something she does not yet have words for. One morning in the 3rd week of November, Dot climbed onto the stool beside Mabel at the counter without saying anything and watched. Mabel placed a small piece of dough in front of her without explanation. Dot looked at it. Then she pressed both hands into it the way she had seen Mabel press both hands into the larger piece, and she looked up. Mabel showed her the motion. Slow. Both hands. Not fighting. Dot did it. Got it wrong. Tried again. Got it closer. Neither of them said anything about it. From that morning forward, Dot was on that stool every day, not always doing anything, sometimes just there, but there with the particular certainty of a child who has decided where she belongs. The cold deepened through the last week of November and into the first days of December with the steady accumulation of a season that meant business. Mabel could feel it in the way the house held its heat differently at night, in the way the mornings came harder, in the way the animals were louder before dawn. She checked the stores each morning the same way she had checked them since October, quietly and without drama, the way you maintained something you built when nobody was looking. She looked at the sky in the evenings the way her father had taught her to look at it, reading the particular weight of the cloud cover, the color at the edge of the mountains when the sun went down. She looked at that sky on the evening of the 4th of December and knew what was coming. She went to the larder and took full count of everything. Then she went to her room and took out the small notebook she had carried from Ohio, the one she used for accounts, and she wrote down everything they had, everything she had put by, and what it would last at current consumption and what it would last if she stretched it carefully. She closed the notebook and put it back in her bag and went to bed and lay in the dark and waited for the morning. It came at 3 in the night rather than morning, not gradually, all at once, the way a door slams shut. The cold dropped like something had been cut loose above the mountains and let fall, and the sound of the ranch under it was different from any sound she had heard in the weeks before. The wood contracting in a new register, the wind finding gaps it had not found before, the water barrel outside going solid with a sound she felt in her back teeth. She was up before the house woke. She dressed in the dark and went to the root cellar with the lamp. She lifted the door and the smell reached her before the light did. The potatoes had gone black at the edges, not all of them, but enough of them to matter. The squash had split along its seams from the freeze, the flesh soft and pale and past saving. She stood in the opening with the lamp held down into the dark and looked at what was there and what was no longer there, and did the new arithmetic. Then she dropped the cellar door and went to the kitchen to light the stove. Amos found it an hour later. She heard him at the cellar. The door lifted, the pause that had no sound in it. The door dropped again, then his steps crossing the yard and into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway with the careful, level expression of a man who has seen something he has not yet calculated the full size of. "How bad?" he said. "The potatoes are mostly gone," she said. "The squash as well. What is left in the cellar will not last the week. How long is the road?" She had already looked at the sky this morning. 3 inches overnight and still coming. The drifting would close the lower road by afternoon. 5 weeks, she said. Maybe 6 if it holds the way it looks like it will hold. He nodded once and went back outside. The children felt the change without being told. By mid-morning, Reed had come in from the field and split more wood than the day required. 4 loads to the house and 2 to the barn. The axe coming down with the concentrated force of a boy, doing the one thing available to him when a situation is larger than his words for it. Finn reappeared at noon with his coat pockets full of dried corn kernels from the back of the feed shed. A small thing, but he had found it without being asked, in the back of a shed that most adults would not have thought to look in. He put the kernels on the kitchen counter without explanation and went back out. Mabel poured them into a jar and put the jar on the shelf. Clara made lunch with less flour than she usually used. She said nothing about the adjustment. Mabel said nothing about noticing it. Dot ate everything on her plate and looked at the pot on the stove and did not ask for more. She was 4 years old. Mabel turned back to the counter because she did not want anyone to see her face. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house had gone quiet, Mabel built up the fire and set coffee on and waited. Amos came into the kitchen a little after 9 and sat at the table. She put the coffee in front of him and went to the larder. She reached to the back of the bottom shelf, behind the flour sack. She lifted the heavy cloth and stepped back so he could see. The crocks of rendered fat, sealed and tied. The jars of preserved wild greens. The dried apple skins pressed flat in paper. The cornmeal packed tight. The salt pork scraps she had saved from the cutting board across 6 weeks, packed in salt. Beneath the counter, the boxes, dried breadcrumbs, pressed wild plums from the south edge, gathered before the freeze, dried herbs, the jar of corn kernels Finn had brought in that afternoon, already added to the row. She stepped back. Amos looked at the shelves. He looked at the boxes. He looked at all the small saved things that had been accumulating in the margins of their days since the 2nd week of October, and he was quiet for a long time. "When did you do this?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Since I arrived," she said. "I did not know we would need it. I only knew we might." She sat down across from him. "If we are careful with the flour, and use the stock to stretch the beans, and go through the salt pork slowly," she said, "this will last 5 weeks, possibly 6, until the road opens." She looked at him steadily across the lamp. "I grew up with not enough. Mr. Calloway," she said. "You learn to see what other people walk past." She said it plainly, not for sympathy, because sympathy was not what she was after and had never been. She said it because it was the accurate explanation, and he was a man who used accurate explanations in preference to comfortable ones, and she had understood that about him since the sheriff's office. He looked at the lamp. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The children don't know how serious it is," he said. No, she said. Clara does. Amos was quiet. She knows, Mabel said more quietly. She has known for a while. He nodded once, looking at the lamp, and did not say anything further about it. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and the cold pressed at the window glass without getting through, and the stove did its steady work between them. He picked up his coffee and drank and set it down and looked at her, not at the stores, but at her, in the way a man looks at something he has just understood differently than he understood it before. He pushed back his chair and said good night and went to bed. She sat at the table for a while after he was gone, looking at the lamp and listening to the house settle around her. The coffee was still warm. She drank what was left of it slowly. She was still sitting there when she heard Clara's step on the stairs. She had learned them all. Clara came into the kitchen in her nightgown with her hair down and her arms not crossed, which was new. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the open larder, which Mabel had left open without planning to. She crossed the kitchen slowly and stood in front of the shelves. Mabel watched her from the table. She watched Clara's eyes move across the shelves, the way her own eyes had moved across that notice board in the sheriff's office, reading backward from what was there to what had been required to put it there. The crocks of fat back to the cutting board, and the weeks of early mornings. The dried greens back to the south tree line in the thin October light. The pressed fruit back to the afternoons when the children had thought Mabel was simply taking a walk to the fence line, all the way back to the woman who had taken the smallest portion at every meal for 6 weeks, who had eaten last and eaten least, and never once asked for anything beyond what she had been given. 1 meal a day. Clara's face changed. It was the particular change that happens when a calculation you have been running with the wrong numbers finally resolves. She stood in front of those shelves for a long time, not moving, just standing in the lamplight with the cold pressing at the window behind her. Then she walked back through the kitchen and up the stairs, and her door closed. Mabel sat at the table and waited. She knew what was on the other side of that closed door, because she had listened to this house long enough to know the difference between all of its silences. She got up and went to the hallway and sat down on the floor outside Clara's door with her back against the wall and her hands in her lap. She did not knock. She did not say anything. She simply sat in the dark and waited. The way you wait when you understand that the only useful thing you can do is be present and make no demands of the moment. The crying went on for a while. It was not the grief crying she had heard through the thin walls in the weeks before, the low, controlled sound of someone who has learned to grieve within strict limits. This was different. This was the sound of a girl who had been running a household since she was 14 years old and had done it correctly, and had found that correct was not the same as enough. And someone had been quietly, steadily filling in the gap between the two for 6 weeks without being asked and without saying a word about it. The crying stopped. The door opened. Clara stood in the doorway looking down at her. Mabel looked up. Then Clara sat down beside her against the wall, her nightgown around her feet, and her hair loose, and her face not arranged into its usual shape. Just 15 years old, and tired in the specific way of someone who has been strong for a very long time, and has finally found a place where they do not have to manage the appearance of it. They sat in the dark hallway without speaking for a while. Then Clara said, "I thought if I did everything right, it would not matter that she was gone." Mabel said nothing. It did not work. Clara said, "No." Mabel said. The wind found the gap at the end of the hallway and moved through it quietly. She always knew what to do, Clara said. About the larder, about all of it. She always knew. You knew, Mabel said. You have been holding this together for over a year. Clara was quiet. I burned the bread, she said finally. You fed them, Mabel said. Every morning, before anyone else was up. Clara looked at her in the dark. Her face was not arranged. It was just her face, and it was very young. and it had been carrying a very heavy thing. She leaned her head back against the wall, and after a moment it tipped sideways and came to rest against Mabel's shoulder. Mabel did not move. She sat in the dark hallway with Clara asleep against her shoulder, and the cold pressing at the house from outside, and the fire banked in the kitchen stove. And she sat there until she was certain the girl was truly sleeping. Then she touched Clara's shoulder and said her name softly, and walked her down the hall to her room, and left her at the door, and went back to her own cot. Morning came the way it always did, without asking whether you were ready for it. The kitchen was cold, and the stove needed lighting, and there was bread to start, and 4 children who would come down those stairs hungry. Mabel got up. That was all there was to it. 3 weeks into December, a letter arrived by way of a trapper passing through who had come down from the high country. He left it on the porch without knocking. Amos brought it to the kitchen and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment before going back out. Mabel looked at it from across the kitchen. Harrow Creek Land and Banking Company, Harwick Greel, Representative. She did not open it. She set it on the table where Amos would find it that evening and went back to her work. At supper, after the children were in bed, she watched Amos read it. She watched his face do the thing it did when it was managing something it did not yet have the full dimensions of. He set the letter on the table when he was done. "They want confirmation of my ability to service the note by April 15th, he said. $340. She said nothing. He looked at the letter. "The spring calves will not cover it. Not this year. Not with the winter we are having." She looked at the lamp between them. "How long has Greel held the note?" she said. "He took it over from Aldrich at the bank in September." Amos said. Aldrich retired. Sold his portfolio to the Harrow Creek Company. September, she said. He nodded. She thought about the notice board in Briggs's office. The 3 names. The winter of 1882. She thought about the laugh on the platform. The short, relieved laugh. She thought about what she had heard that October afternoon on the platform before the rejection. The 2 men in the good coats talking near the end of the rail car about something she had not been paying close attention to at the time, because she had been managing other things. She had written it down that evening in her notebook, because she had grown up in a house where you wrote things down when you heard them and sorted out their significance later. She did not say any of this to Amos yet. She said, "I would like to speak to Reverend Vaught when the road opens. He has been in this valley longer than anyone, longer than the bank, longer than Greel. I would like to understand the history of the land here better than I do." Amos nodded slowly. "All right," he said. She got up and cleared the table and went to her room and took out the small notebook and opened it to the entry from the 14th of October, 1883, and read what she had written there. The Calloway note. That was what he had called it. She had written it down because she wrote things down. The Calloway note, spoken between Harwick Greel and his son Landon on the platform at Greystone Station, while a woman stood on the steps of a train car 2 feet away, being managed through an uncomfortable but professionally necessary situation. Spoken in October, before the winter, before the cellar, before the letter, before she had stepped off the train. She lay in the dark and felt the cold pressing at the house from all sides, and she thought about a man who had planned for a specific winter before the winter had arrived. She thought about 3 families who had lost their land in 1882. She thought about what it meant to hold the note on a ranch that controlled the primary water source for the Upper Valley, and what you could do with that land once you held it, and why a man in a good coat would come to a cold mountain town in October to personally reject a matrimonial prospect he could have simply not corresponded with. She thought about all of it carefully and in order. Then she closed her eyes and went to sleep. The rest of December passed, the way a hard winter passes when you have enough to get through it and are no longer afraid of the arithmetic. Reed split wood every morning before Amos came out of the barn. Finn found things: a cache of dried corn in the back of the second outbuilding, an overlooked sack of dried lentils behind the feed bags. He brought each thing to the kitchen counter without explanation, and Mabel put each thing in its place without commentary, and this became its own kind of conversation. Clara made breakfast, and Mabel worked beside her, and they talked about the bread, the pastry, the beans, the stock. Not about other things, just about the work in front of them. But the distance between them in the kitchen was different from the distance of October, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything about it because saying it would have been less accurate than simply working side by side at the same counter in the same kitchen on the same cold December mornings. Dot was on her stool every day. January came in with more snow, and the road stayed closed, and the stores held. Mabel made the same quiet adjustments each morning: a little less salt pork, a little more stock. The beans stretched a day further, the cornmeal rationed against the flour. She did not talk about it. She simply did it. One evening in the middle of January, Amos stayed at the table after the children had gone up, not with intention. In the way of a man who has forgotten to leave because the room is less heavy than it usually is. He turned his cup in his hands. She washed the dishes and matched his silence the way you match a rhythm you have not been told but have been hearing long enough to know. After a while he said, "Clara sat at the table for breakfast this morning." He said it not to her but to the middle distance, the way you say something when you are still working out what it means. "Yes," Mabel said. "She has not done that in a long time," he said. She dried her hands and said nothing. She did not need to. He sat at the table a while longer after she went to her room, the lamp burning between his hands and the cold at the windows, and the house holding its warmth around him. She sat on the edge of her cot. There was the small notebook in her bag with the entry from October 14th, and the words she had written down because she had grown up in a house where you wrote things down. There was April 15th, 11 weeks away. She lay down and pulled the blanket up and listened to the house settle around her into its nighttime shape, each sound familiar now. And she closed her eyes, and she let the dark come in. February in the high country did not end so much as it loosened its grip 1 degree at a time, so slowly you could not point to a single morning and say that was when it changed. But Mabel felt it, in the way the light came through the kitchen window at a slightly different angle each week, in the way the snow on the south-facing slope behind the barn began to pull back from the fence line, not much, just enough to show a thin, dark edge of ground beneath, in the way Dot started leaving her coat unbuttoned on the porch instead of clutching it closed with both fists. The stores had held, not comfortably, but they had held, which was the only measure that mattered. She was sitting with the February arithmetic one evening when Amos came in from the barn earlier than usual and set something on the table beside her notebook. It was a letter, still sealed, that had come in the last delivery before the road closed. A letter she had not seen before. He said, "This came in October, before you arrived. I put it in the barn office, and then the road closed, and I did not think about it again until today." She looked at the envelope. Harrow Creek Land and Banking Company. She looked at the letter without touching it. He opened it himself. Read it. Set it on the table face up. It was dated September 28th, 1883, 2 weeks before she had stepped off the train at Greystone Station. It stated that Harrow Creek Land and Banking Company had acquired the Callaway note from the estate of Gerald Aldrich, and that the terms of the original agreement would be honored with one amendment. The amendment was a clause, written in the careful, clean language of a man who understood how to put dangerous things into documents so that they did not look dangerous until the moment they were intended to be. The clause stated that in the event of default, The company reserved the right to assess the property at its current productive value rather than its assessed value for the purposes of determining settlement. Mabel read it twice. The productive value of a ranch that had lost its root cellar to a hard freeze and had run its stores down to the bottom was considerably lower than its assessed value, considerably lower than the $340 of the original note, which meant that if Amos defaulted in April, Greel would not simply take the ranch in settlement of the debt. He would take it and walk away owing Amos the difference between what it was worth on paper and what Greel's own men said it was worth in the ground. She set the letter down. "You need to take this to someone who understands land law," she said. "Before April." Amos looked at the letter with the specific tiredness of a man who has been looking at difficult things for long enough that the looking no longer surprises him. "Reverend Vaught," he said. He remembered. "Yes," Mabel said. "And whoever Vaught says to take it to after that." Amos nodded. She picked up her notebook from the table and opened it to the entry from October 14th and set it beside the letter without saying anything. Just set it there so he could read what she had written in her careful, even accounting hand on the evening of the day she had arrived. He read it slowly. She watched his face. The Calloway note. He read aloud, quietly, and then the names. Landon. And his father's voice. He looked up at her. "I write things down," she said. "My father kept accounts. I kept them with him. I did not know what it meant at the time. I wrote it because I wrote most things." He looked at the notebook entry and the letter side by side on the table in the lamplight. He was quiet for a long enough time that the fire settled in the stove and the wind found the south gap in the eaves and moved through it. "He knew," Amos said, "before you even got here. He knew I would need someone through the winter. He made sure I would not have one." Mabel said nothing. She let him arrive at it in his own order. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He put his hand on the notebook for a moment, not picking it up, just resting his hand on it. He said, "I owe you more than a meal a day." She took the notebook back and closed it. "You owe me what we agreed," she said. "Nothing changes that." He looked at her across the table. She met his eyes and held them the way she had held them in the sheriff's office in October, because looking away would cost her something she could not afford, and because this was a man who respected a straight look above most other things. After a while he nodded, picked up his coffee, and they sat in the kitchen with the lamp between them and the cold pulling back degree by degree outside. And for the first time since October, Mabel felt the full weight of what she had been carrying shift slightly in its distribution. March arrived the way springs arrive in the high country, not gently, but with the abrupt, almost aggressive insistence of a season that has been waiting behind a door and finally lost patience with waiting. The snow on the south slope was gone by the 8th. The road below the ridge showed clear by the 12th. The mud that replaced the snow was deep and honest and cold, and it smelled like the beginning of something. The letter came on a Thursday, brought up from Greystone by the first rider to use the road after it opened. It was addressed to Mabel Hurst, care of the Calloway Ranch, Greystone, Colorado Territory. It was from the railroad company, head matron position, new hotel dining room in the next valley east, guaranteed wages, a room of her own, and a monthly figure that represented more money than she had seen in a single number in years. She read it twice at the kitchen table. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went back to the bread she had been working. Finn found her in the yard that afternoon. He stood at the fence line with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at her with those calculating eyes that had been running their particular assessments since the afternoon on the wagon bench in October. "Are you going?" he said. "I have not decided," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Dot has been calling you something. She will not say it out loud yet. Just when she thinks nobody is listening. I heard her twice." Mabel looked at the kitchen window. Through the glass she could see the stool at the counter and the shape of Dot on it, small hands in the bread dough, pressing with both hands the way she had been shown. "What does she call me?" Mabel said. Finn pulled his hands out of his pockets and looked at the fence post. He shrugged, which was his way of saying he had said what he intended to say, and the rest was someone else's to deal with. He went back inside. Mabel stood in the yard with the cold mud under her boots and the letter in her apron pocket, and the mountains around the valley showing their dark rock above the snow line. And she stood there for a long time, looking at the kitchen window. 4 days after the letter came, Mabel rode into Greystone to see Reverend Cornelius Vaught. He was a tall man in his 60s with the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had been listening to difficult things for a long time and had learned not to rush the people bringing them. His church was a plain, well-kept building at the north end of the main street, and his office behind it smelled of old paper and good wood, and something that had been warming on the small stove in the corner for a while. She sat across from him and she put the letter from Harrow Creek on his desk and the notebook entry beside it, and she told him what she had understood about Harwick Greel and the Calloway note and the amendment clause, and the 3 families who had lost their land in the valley in the winter of 1882, whose names she had memorized from the notice board in Briggs's office in October, because she memorized most things she needed to know. Vaught read both documents carefully. He read the notebook entry twice. "This is your handwriting," he said. "From the 14th of October," she said. "The evening I arrived." He set both papers down and folded his hands on his desk and looked at her with the specific attention of a man who is recalibrating something. "The 3 families from 1882, she said. "Do you know if any of them are still in the area?" "2, Vaught said. "The Brenners are in Greystone, boarding at the Miller place. The Ashworths are at their daughter's property on the East Road." She nodded. "Would they speak to someone from the Territorial Land Office?" she said, "if someone asked them directly about the terms they were offered when they lost their property?" Vaught was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I believe they would." She said, "I need you to write a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Denver. I will write one as well. I need them to have a representative here before the 15th of April. That gives us 5 weeks. Vaught looked at her across the desk. "You have been planning this for a while," he said. "Since January," she said, "when the road was still closed." He picked up his pen. He said, "Tell me what you need the letter to say." She told him. He wrote. She rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon, with the mud of the spring road on her boots, and the cold still in the air, but a different cold now. The cold of something moving rather than something stopped. She unsaddled the horse and put her up and went into the kitchen and took off her coat and hung it on the hook and stood at the counter and finished what there was to finish. She did not tell Amos what she had done. Not yet. She needed the pieces in place first. Clara came to her on a Sunday morning 4 days later, while Mabel was in the kitchen garden turning the first soil of the season. The ground was still cold and heavy, the kind of digging that requires you to lean into it, and Mabel was leaning when she heard Clara's step at the garden edge. She looked up. Clara was standing there with something in her hands, a book, worn through at the spine, held together with a length of cotton twine tied in a careful knot. The covers were dark with the handling of many years, and the pages at the corners were soft with use. Mabel straightened and waited. "This was my mother's," Clara said. Her voice was level with the effort of keeping it level. "Her recipes, her mother's before that. I have not let anyone touch it since she died." The garden was quiet. The mud was cold under Mabel's boots. In the yard beyond the gate she was aware of Reed at the fence line and Dot on the porch, and the particular stillness that comes over a place when something is happening in it that will not unhappen. Clara held the book out. "If you are leaving," she said, "take it. So it goes somewhere it will be used." Mabel looked at the book. She looked at Clara. 15 years old, with her jaw set and her eyes bright and her arms extended with the full weight of the most difficult thing she had ever offered another person. She stepped forward and took the book with both hands. She carried it inside and set it on the shelf beside the stove, in the place where the morning light came through the window first, where it would be reached for and used and would smell like this kitchen, where it belonged. She came back out to the garden. "I am not leaving," she said. Clara looked at the book through the window. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once, in the way her father nodded when a thing had been decided and there was nothing further to deliberate, and she went inside. From his place at the fence line, Reed watched the door close behind his sister. Then he set down the fence tool he had been holding and picked up the axe and began to cut the week's wood without being asked. He cut enough for 2 weeks. He stacked it at the kitchen door in the same careful rows he had been stacking wood all winter, and he went back to the fence and picked up his tool and did not say anything about any of it. It was the first time he had done something large without his father asking him to do it. The response from the Territorial Land Office arrived on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of March, forwarded to Mabel by Reverend Vaught. A representative would be present in Greystone on the 28th of March. 3 weeks before the April 15th deadline, they requested the relevant documentation be available for review. She put the letter in her apron pocket and went back to the kitchen. That evening she told Amos. She told him all of it. The October entry in her notebook, the letter she had taken to Vaught, the 2 families from 1882, the territorial representative coming on the 28th. He sat across the table from her and listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You did this from January," he said. "From the night you showed me the September letter," she said. He looked at his hands on the table. She said, "I need you to trust what I have put together. The representative will want to see the amendment clause and my notebook entry and whatever the Brenners and Ashworths are willing to say. I believe that will be enough. But you need to bring the family into town on the 28th. All of them." He looked up at her. "All right," he said. It was the 28th of March, a Friday, when Amos drove the wagon into Greystone with all 4 children in the bed and Mabel on the bench beside him. The road was clear, and the mud was firming, and the mountains had that sharp, freshly uncovered look they had in early spring when the snow pulled back and the rock showed clean underneath. Mabel had the notebook in her coat pocket. She had the September letter in the other pocket. She had written out a clear accounting of the amendment clause and its likely application in the event of default, written in the same careful hand she had used for her father's accounts in Ohio, organized the way a woman organizes things when she has been keeping accounts her whole life and understands what a document needs to do. Harwick Greel's wagon was outside the land office when they pulled into the main street. Landon Greel was on the steps, talking to a man in a gray coat. He looked up when the Callaway wagon came down the street, and Mabel saw him see her, and she watched his face do something she could not quite read, and then go smooth again. She climbed down from the wagon. Dot pressed against her side immediately, one small hand finding the fabric of her skirt and holding on without looking up. Clara came up on her other side. Reed stood behind them with the particular stillness he had carried all winter, and Finn stood slightly to the side, watching Landon Greel with the cool, attentive expression of a boy who has been watching things carefully for a long time and has gotten good at it. Amos stood beside her. The territorial representative was a man named Calhoun, thin and precise, with the look of someone who had spent a career reading documents and had learned not to be impressed by the people who produced them. He took Mabel's notebook entry and the September letter and the accounting she had written out, and he read all 3 without comment. He asked her 3 questions. She answered all 3. He asked Amos 2 questions. Amos answered both. Then Vaught brought the Brenners in. They were an older couple, gray-haired and careful, and the woman held her husband's arm when they walked in the way people hold on to each other when they have been through something together that still has weight. They told Calhoun what they had been told when they lost their property in the winter of 1882. The productive value assessment, the same clause, the same representative from Harrow Creek Land and Banking Company. The Ashworth son came in after them and confirmed the same. Harwick Greele had been standing at the edge of the room since Vaught brought the Brenners in. He was a large man, and he was good at standing in ways that suggested authority. But Mabel had been watching him since October, and she watched him now, and she saw the specific moment when the posture changed. It was a small change, a settling, the way a structure settles when something load-bearing has given way. Calhoun set down the documents. He looked at Greele. He said, "I will need to review the original note and all associated documentation in full before I can issue any determination. But I am prepared to state for the record that the amendment clause as written in the September letter warrants a full territorial review for potential fraudulent practice. I am also prepared to recommend a stay of any collection action against the Calloway property pending that review." Harwick Greele said nothing. Landon Greele was no longer in the room. Vaught was standing at the window, and he caught Mabel's eye and gave her a single, small nod. The nod of a man who has done his part and is satisfied with how it has been received. Greele looked at the room, at the Brenners and the Ashworth son and Calhoun with his documents, and Amos standing beside the large woman in the deep blue dress, broad-shouldered and steady. The woman he had dismissed on a platform in October as if she were a column of numbers that did not add up. She had turned out to be the woman who held every number he had hoped to bury, written down in careful hand in a small notebook she had carried from Ohio. On the evening of the very day he had folded her photograph in half and walked away laughing. He put his hat on and walked out. Nobody watched him go. The street outside was cold and clear, and the mountains were sharp against the sky, and the town of Greystone was going about its Friday business around them when they came out of the land office. Mabel stood on the boardwalk and looked at the street. The same street she had walked on in October with mud on her boots and no direction, and a dress that had served no purpose other than to be folded in half in a man's coat pocket. The same town that had stood still on the platform and said nothing. Dot still had her hand in the fabric of Mabel's skirt. Clara stood to her right with her arms at her sides, not crossed. Reed was behind them, and Finn was slightly to the left, already looking down the street toward the trading post, already thinking about whatever came next in the way that was entirely his own. Amos came to stand beside her. He was quiet for a long time. He looked at the street, and then at the mountains, and then at her. He said, "I have 4 children. The ranch is 8 miles out, and the road gets bad in winter. You know all of that." "I know," she said. "Stay," he said, "as my wife, if that is what you want." He stopped. Then he said it quietly, in the rough, unpolished way of a man who does not traffic in speeches, but knows when something needs to be said completely. "I want you to take the largest biscuit at my table," he said. "From now on, every morning, that is what I want." She looked at him. She looked at Dot's hand in her skirt, and Clara standing without her arms crossed, and Reed watching his boots, and Finn who had turned back from whatever he had been looking at down the street to hear the answer. "Yes," she said, "that is what I want." Something moved through Amos's face, a loosening of something that had been held tight for a long time, not just through this winter but through the one before it and the one before that, and possibly longer than she would ever know the full count of. He offered her his arm. She took it. Behind them, Finn leaned toward Reed and said in what he clearly believed was a quiet voice, "Does this mean she stays forever?" Reed said, "Yes." Finn considered this for a moment. "Good," he said. "I already told the dog it could sleep inside. I told it 2 weeks ago." Clara closed her eyes briefly with the expression of someone storing an injury for future reference. Dot said nothing. She had not let go of the fabric of Mabel's skirt. She did not let go now. She simply shifted her grip from the skirt to Mabel's hand, her small fingers wrapping around 2 of Mabel's larger ones, and she looked up at the mountains the same way she looked at the bread dough from her stool, with total, settled attention, as if the outcome had always been obvious and she had simply been waiting for the adults to catch up. They walked down the boardwalk together, the 6 of them, in the thin spring light with the cold still in it, the mountains clean and sharp behind the town and the mud of the road drying at the edges. Mabel Hurst had stepped off a train in Greystone in October with 43 cents in her coat pocket and a dress she had let out at the seams with her own needle because she had wanted to arrive looking like someone worth arriving for. A man had folded her photograph in half and walked away laughing, and a town had stood still and watched and said nothing. And she had picked up her bag and walked off the platform because there was no other thing to do, and because she had been doing the only available thing her whole life and had gotten very good at it. She had asked for 1 meal a day because that was the correct amount of space to request from a world that had not historically made room for her. She had not known that a household was quietly, stubbornly, in its own particular and unannounced way, making room for her the entire time. 1 cracker on a wagon bench, 1 step back from a doorway, 1 loaf of bread that rose the way it was supposed to and was set on the table without comment, 1 stool at a kitchen counter, 1 lamp on a shelf, 1 smooth latch on a door that had been stiff. 1 book held out with both hands by a 15-year-old girl who had been running out of room to carry what she had been carrying. 1 small hand, letting go of a skirt and finding fingers to hold instead. Until the woman who had spent her whole life calculating the smallest portion she could reasonably ask for sat down at a table that was finally hers and did not calculate anything at all.